What did the Japanese really think of transgender American pilots in World War II? The question appears on the screen like an accusation and an invitation at once. It promises scandal, revelation, a hidden story tucked into the margins of combat reports and dog-eared memoirs. It is a question that brings the modern world of identity into the metal and oil of 1942, an anachronism on its face, and precisely because of that, worth asking. Not to force a contemporary label onto the past, but to test the limits of what the archive can tell us, and to understand why the archive speaks so seldom on matters of private identity in wartime. Before we begin to chase answers, a clear caveat. Across the principal wartime testimonies, unit records, and veteran memoirs that form the backbone of this narrative, there is no direct, primary source evidence that Japanese pilots, during combat, in intelligence reports, or in the post-war testimony gathered by historians, identified or discussed American aviators as transgender in any sense that maps cleanly onto modern usage. The question then starts in a space of absence as much as curiosity. What follows will make that absence an object of inquiry rather than a vacuum to be filled by speculation. If this question already has your curiosity, stay with me. There are archives, testimonies, and tactical shifts here that will complicate more than they simplify. If you want the full deep dive into what the records actually say, subscribe and keep watching. The smell of avgas hits first, sharp, sweet, like a chemical memory. The sun is a flat coin over Guadalcanal's low palms. Saburo Sakai stands beside a war-worn Mitsubishi A6M0, the plane's paint seam rubbed thin where a pilot's hand had found the fuselage in greeting or prayer. He is young, a veteran already, and he has learned to measure life in rigid seconds, the time between engine start and the carrier's roar, the time between enemy sighting and the first shot. In his memoir, he remembers the heat on the diaphragm of his mask, the taste of metal dust after crash landings, the sound of a wing tearing in the sky like a flag. For Japanese pilots like Sakai, the war was invested with layers of meaning before it began, layers shaped by the language of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Yamato, an amalgam of Bushido, nationalistic education, and militaristic propaganda that insisted on honor, self-sacrifice, and a kind of spiritual purity. This was not merely a rhetorical device. It saturated schools, shrines, and the training grounds where young men were taught to accept the probability of death with calm. It made the emperor into an axis of cosmic duty and made the battlefield into a stage where personal valor confirmed a national virtue. American adversaries were cast in some pre-war Japanese imagery and talk as comfortable, indulgent, and morally soft, citizens of a brash, moneyed society. Propaganda films and leaflets sometimes characterize the United States as decadent, its strength superficial. These themes did not necessarily translate into coherent, widely held beliefs among every pilot. Human perception is messy. Yet the cultural frame existed, and when Japanese squadrons launched in the months after Pearl Harbor, victories felt like validation. When the Zero danced in the air, it seemed to confirm a myth, a noble instrument flown by noble men. The early months of war delivered a cascade of successes for Japan. In the first year, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, the strafing of the Dutch East Indies, Japanese airmen experienced tactical and strategic triumphs that fed into narratives of superiority. The Zero, as a machine, played a starring role. It was light, highly maneuverable, and optimized for dogfighting at low speed. Zeros could point their noses into a turn and hang there, and pilots who learned to exploit that thinness of wing and engine would frequently find themselves staring down an enemy who could not match their agility. But machines have limits that myth cannot erase. The Zero's advantages came at a cost: little armor, minimal self-sealing fuel tanks, and no industry behind it able to replace pilots or planes indefinitely. Those vulnerabilities were not yet decisive in 1941, early 1942. What mattered most in the imagination of many Japanese flyers was the apparent contrast: a warrior ethic, an aircraft that moved like a living thing, facing opponents who initially appeared disorganized and fragile by comparison. That impression is vital to the story, because it helps explain how Japanese pilots perceive their enemies in cultural, not just tactical terms. When reports from carrier pilots described American flyers as reckless or lacking spirit, those words carried freight. They were evaluations of conduct, sure, but also shorthand for deeper, pre-existing assumptions about the American way of life. The archive shows this language in intelligence summaries and in the tone of post-battle letters home. Still, it is a mistake to equate such descriptors with specific judgments about gender identity. Terms like effeminate or decadent in wartime propaganda referenced cultural critique more than they did substantive assessments of individual bodies. The myth hardened early because early Allied responses were often ad hoc. U.S. naval aviation in 1941-1942 suffered from dispersed training standards, inexperienced carrier crews, and a shortage of modern fighters in the Pacific theater. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat that American pilots initially flew was heavier and less agile than the Zero in a turning fight. Its strengths lay elsewhere: durability, better armor, and a more powerful engine when diving. American tactics evolved not by matching the Zero in the air's poetry, but by discovering a new grammar of engagement.
A tactical pivot crystallized in the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver developed by Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch. Thatch's idea was simple. Two friendly fighters would fly converging arcs so that if an enemy dove on one, the other could swing into a firing position. It was a cooperative gambit, safety through mutual support rather than single-handed mastery. Where Japanese doctrine often celebrated individual maneuvermanship and decisive one-on-one encounters, American tactics increasingly emphasized interdependence. The weave became both a practical counter and an emblem of doctrinal difference: teamwork over individual aerial dueling. Guadalcanal would be where theory met its harshest testing ground. The air battles around Henderson Field turned into a grinding attritional contest that eroded pilot experience on both sides. Saburo Sakai's wound there, he lost sight in one eye after his cockpit was punctured by shrapnel, wasn't merely a personal catastrophe. It was a symbol of the war's human toll and the fragility of assumptions. Pilots who had expected ceremonial valor instead encountered chaos, exhaustion, and an enemy that refused to fold easily into preconceptions. Recreate a morning over the Solomons. A dozen Zeros climb from an escort carrier, their noses biting the air. Below, Wildcats circle in ragged formations around the tiny patch of airstrip that is Henderson Field. Fighters and dive bombers protecting a defenseless runway. An island air force that, for all its smallness, will not yield. The first contact is violent and compressed. Engines scream. The sun skitters off aluminum skin. The shell punctures a fuel line. Smoke blooms like a black cloud from a wing. A pilot loses track of altitude in the confusion. A Wildcat turns into a Zero and finds a turret of bullets waiting, where a Japanese pilot had expected nothing but terror. The Thatch Weave pulls an enemy into a crossfire. Lives are saved by coordination, by the refusal of pilots to fight solo. For Japanese commanders, these encounters were a revelation. Tactical notes from unit headquarters begin to reflect recalibration. Complaints about American staying power, observations about new tactics, the grudging acknowledgement that the adversary's material inferiority did not translate straightforwardly into weakness. What had been framed as moral or spiritual superiority met a stubborn, adaptive opponent whose strengths lay in industry, attrition management, and tactical flexibility. This is not to overstate the case. Japanese pilots continued to fight with professionalism and courage, and individual valor remained central to the narratives they told afterward. But as months bled into years, the balance of factors shifted. The United States carried the infrastructure to replace losses, accelerate pilot production, and introduce newer, more robust aircraft, F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs, designed to address the Zero's earlier dominance.
The Hellcat, especially, arrived in sufficient numbers to contest control of the air with engines and armor that made the kind of sacrificial dogfighting the Zero had thrived on less decisive. What the Japanese perceived in their American foes was therefore neither static nor monolithic. Early on, there were remarks and official rhetoric that drew on cultural images of the United States as soft, corrupted by consumerism and individualism. Later, the tenor of reports shifts to a grudging respect for American endurance, mass, and tactical ingenuity. Veterans like Sakai, when they returned to civilian life, would sometimes speak of the enemy in terms tinged with admiration, acknowledging skill, courage, and the human face behind the machine. It is important here to separate two different kinds of perception. One is a rhetorical or ideological perception, how propaganda and pre-war education encouraged pilots and citizens to think of the enemy. The other is the acute, sensory perception of combat, what a pilot saw, heard, and felt in the moment. Neither fully explains the other, but together they shape the historical record. And then there is the cross-cutting issue that gives the title its charge: gender. How did Japanese pilots conceive of American masculinity? How did they react if, in the course of an interrogation or a captured pilot's medical file, they encountered men whose presentation or past behavior confounded masculine norms? These are delicate questions. Wartime vocabularies for gender variance were crude and medicalized: cross-dressing, sexual perversion, language colored by stigma. Military record-keeping prioritized fitness for service and security clearance over nuanced personal identity. In many cases, the records that might bear the traces of gender nonconformity, medical and psychiatric files, court-martial papers, police reports, were folded into bureaucracy and then lost or left unanalyzed. To be methodical, the archival record is mostly silent on the specific category of transgender applied to American pilots as a group or even as isolated individuals. There are instances of gender nonconforming behavior being noted in military contexts worldwide, but these tend to be rare, often pathologized, and typically addressed through administrative or disciplinary measures rather than open discussion. Moreover, period language does not map cleanly onto contemporary identity terms. A man who cross-dressed in private for reasons of comfort, or a person who later in life adopted a different gender presentation, would rarely, if ever, be able to register that fact in a way that a 21st century scholar can read without substantial interpretive work. This methodological difficulty matters for Japanese perceptions. Propaganda that accused Americans of decadence could also be deployed to feminize or belittle an enemy, painting the adversary as weak because he supposedly lacked asceticism or martial seriousness.
But such rhetorical feminization is a political caricature more than it is an ethnographic record. Even when Japanese intelligence or commentary noted effeminacy in enemy portrayals, it was usually shorthand for moral criticism, not a diagnosis of personal gender identity. Concluding from that shorthand that Japanese pilots perceived some American aviators as transgender would be an interpretive leap that the sources do not sustain. Which is to say, the silence in the archives is meaningful. It tells us more about what wartime institutions recorded and deemed important than it tells us about private lived experiences that did not fit neatly into military categories. In practice, service members who deviated from norms of gender expression were more likely to be dealt with administratively, dismissed, court-martialed, or quietly discharged than they were to be celebrated as exceptions. Such actions, where they occurred, might leave traces in personnel files, but they rarely show up in combat reports or in the writings of enemy pilots assessing combat prowess. Still, there are layers worth exploring. Japanese intelligence made assessments of American social life that sometimes conflated gendered critique with racialized or cultural denigration. Leaflets and radio broadcasts targeted at American troops leaned on stereotypes that presented the United States as a place of indulgence and moral laxity. If a Japanese pilot read that the enemy nation was decadent, what he or she imagined of individual American men would be filtered through those images. This cultural filtering could have produced a vague sense that the American male body was less homogeneous, less stoic, less bound to a warrior code than the idealized Japanese male. But again, vague sense is the operative phrase. The documents rarely, if ever, single out transgender identity as a recognized category among American aviators. The practical battlefield dynamics further complicated matters. In the chaos of aerial combat, identity becomes subordinate to identification. Is the plane a wildcat or a Zero? Is the pilot momentarily competent or fatally wounded? The battlefield record stays fixated on the tactical: altitude, heading, gun camera footage, witness reports. Those records were created for operational learning, not for capturing nuances of identity. This is one reason why the archive is thin on the question posed by the title. And yet, the question continues to haunt historians because it touches on the interplay of public myth, private identity, and the politics of recognition. Why does the absence of explicit evidence matter? Because contemporary debates about inclusion in armed service, about who is permitted to fight and in what uniform, have a history that stretches back into the 20th century. The very policies that kept certain bodies out or pushed them to the margins are the same institutional mechanisms that erase those bodies from the historical narrative.
When a record lacks mention of transgender pilots, that absence might reflect not an absence of such people in reality, but an absence of institutional will to record or acknowledge them. For now, though, the story that continues to be best supported by the record is one of tactical and material recalibration. The Japanese conception of their American enemy moved from caricature to grudging respect through exposure to American persistence and innovation. In the Sky Above the Solomons, the thatch weave and the wildcat's toughness became lived corrections to the earlier myth of American softness. Consider one exchange that crystallizes the intellectual shift. Japanese dispatches that once trumpeted the supposed spiritual weakness of American flyers begin over months of combat to state the more prosaic facts of attrition. They note pilot shortages, industrial output, and the arrival of aircraft with different performance envelopes. They record with growing concern the American capacity to rotate inexperienced pilots in, to train them rapidly, and to sustain a campaign that blunted the Japanese edge in maneuverability. These are not cultural judgments, but logistical realities. Witnesses like Sakai would later reflect on these changes not with triumph, but with a melancholy recognition. The war had become a grinding contest between systems, rather than a theater for personal honor. The cockpit remains, in these recollections, a place of human vulnerability. Pilots are wounded, burned, blinded. Their bodies, not their identities, keep appearing in the record because the state is oriented towards bodies that can fight, be counted, be recorded, be replaced. That fact points towards an archival logic. The military records what matters to command and control. Personal identity, unless it directly affects unit cohesion or performance, was often invisible to that arithmetic. That invisibility is precisely why the question in the title can never be answered with confidence from the sources available in this first sweep. The evidence, as we can see in memoirs, tactical reports, and propaganda, speaks loudly about national character and about tactical adaptation. It speaks far less about individual gender variance. What we can do, and what the remainder of this long investigation aims to do, is lay those evidentiary limits bare, examine what kinds of records might bear traces if they exist, and show how the cultural language of the time could both produce and obscure perceptions of gender. Before we move deeper into the tactical arc and the systemic comparisons that explain why perception changed, there is one small but necessary methodological pause. To speak about gender in the 1940s without careful framing is to risk projecting 21st century categories onto a past whose actors use different words for different realities.
Military psychiatrists and medical examiners in the 1940s cataloged what they called sexual deviations through lenses laced with moral panic and pseudoscience. Police reports sometimes used cross-dressing as a catch-all term. Such language is not equivalent to anyone's modern self-identification. Where the record mentions cross-dressing or homosexual acts, the historian must ask, was this behavior a secret kept from comrades, a medical pathology noted for discharge, a criminalized act reported by local authorities, or something else entirely? Each possibility carries different implications for how Japanese observers might have perceived an American pilot who did not conform to masculine norms. We can point to a few broad archival realities that shape the limits of what follows. U.S. Armed Forces had medical and psychiatric screening procedures that classified recruits for fitness, but those procedures were inconsistent and often focused on immediate functional capacity rather than complex identity. Military personnel records were primarily administrative. They documented rank, station, casualties, disciplinary action, information of operational importance. Japanese records, particularly after 1943, were increasingly fragmentary as the pressure of war dispersed archivists and destroyed documents. Oral histories, veteran interviews collected decades after the fact, provide invaluable human perspective, but memory reshapes as it ages. What was once insignificant can gain meaning, and what was once important can be forgotten. So the terrain ahead is one of layered uncertainty. There are firm things to build the story on, the mechanics of the thatch weave, the introduction of the Hellcat, the attrition statistics that historians have reconstructed, the vivid, often brutal accounts from veterans like Sakai. And there are areas where historians must be careful: private identity, stigmatized behaviors, the gaps left by bureaucratic priorities. The historian's task, then, is to hold both, to tell the story of the air war in as full a sensory detail as sources allow, while also maintaining strict evidentiary discipline when the subject veers into private identity. We proceed then into the war's middle years, into Guadalcanal's protracted strain and the growing mismatch between Japanese pilot production and the industrial scale of the United States. We will return to Sakai and to other named pilots, tracing how individual runes make a collective story. we will map how tactics like the thatch weave not only saved lives, but also undermined myth, how aircraft design reflected institutional priorities, and how the language of propaganda both revealed and concealed perceptions of the enemy. And when we come to the specific question of gender identity, what, if anything, Japanese pilots noticed or recorded about American bodies, we will treat the silence with as much seriousness as any piece of testimony.
For now, the skies over the Solomons have been a crucible. The weave, the damaged cockpit, the pilot's blood on the throttle, these are the recurring images that will guide us deeper into the archive and, eventually, into the more fraught conversations about identity, record-keeping, and historical method. For now, the skies over the Solomons have been a crucible. The weave, the damaged cockpit, the pilot's blood on the throttle, these are the recurring images that will guide us deeper into the archive and, eventually, into the more fraught conversations about identity, record-keeping, and historical method. The next months fold into a different tempo. The Japanese carrier fleet, once a sweeping instrument of rapid conquest, begins to feel the strain of attrition. Pilots who survived one engagement are not guaranteed the chance to fly another. Experience is whittled away in uneven bites, and the apprenticeship cycle that once filled the ranks cannot keep pace with loss. For the United States, the early shocks of 1941-42 give way to an industrial counterpunch. Training programs expand, replacement aircraft roll off production lines, and tactics adapt in response to hard-won lessons. Each side's institutional capacities shape how its pilots survive and how their enemies perceive them. The tactical adjustments have faces and names. John S. Thatch, the naval aviator who devised the weave that bears his name, did not theorize from some sterile office. He tested ideas in simulators of paper and in the rude laboratory of squadron maneuvers. He understood that parity in the air could be achieved by trading the solitude of one-on-one duels for mutual covering fire. The maneuver is simple in description and complicated in execution. Two fighters fly slightly offset courses so that if an enemy commits to one, the other is positioned to swing into a lethal angle. The weave multiplies survivability, and it does so by institutionalizing cooperation. The aircraft become paired lifelines. From a Japanese doctrinal point of view, that adaptation required emotional translation. Much of IJN air culture prized the skill of the single pilot, the one whose fighting spirit and mastery of the machine triumphed in close combat. The thatch weave, by contrast, distributed success across a team, diluting the trope of lone aerial mastery. Reports and memos from the latter half of 1942 begin to register this shift. Field notes indicate puzzlement, then annoyance, then grudging respect. Tactical manuals were amended, and training syllabi were tinkered with. That grind of institutional learning is visible in unit war diaries and in the after-action memoranda archived by both navies. Guadalcanal is the place where tactical theory meets attrition and where individual stories crystallize into institutional facts. Henderson Field, a thin scar of runway guarded by improvised air defenses and exhausted ground troops, becomes a magnet for repeated assaults.
The Japanese approach the island with expectations of a swift campaign. What they encounter is tenacity. Wildcat pilots, often outmaneuvered in tight-turning fights, survive by wrestling the engagement into altitudes and energy states where their aircraft's strengths, sturdiness, robust structure, dive speed matter more. The pilot's skill remains crucial, but so too does doctrinal improvisation. Saburo Sakai's wound, an explosive fragment that cost him sight in one eye, is a single terrible datum point in a larger process. His subsequent survival and return to flight duty are recorded in his memoir and in squadron logs. They illustrate both individual resilience and the limits of romanticized combat. The human body, when damaged, interrupts myth. The time between a pilot's injury and the next sortie is measured not merely by courage, but by the machinery of hospitals, convalescents, medical boards, and replacement strategies. These are precisely the kinds of institutional traces that populate archives, and precisely the places where private identities were rarely recorded, unless they interfered with fitness for service. Midway in June 1942 is often invoked as the strategic hinge of the Pacific Campaign. There, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 fleet carriers in a single cataclysmic series of strikes. Midway altered the material balance and forced senior Japanese commanders into a counter-narrative. The idea of an invincible fleet could no longer dominate planning conversations. Material loss has psychological effects. The shock reverberates in tactical conservatism and in the recalibration of aerial doctrine. The U.S. Navy, burned and battered, learns how to combine intelligence, cryptanalysis, and operational daring. Japanese planners, deprived of the tempo and carrier strength that once amplified air power, struggle to project the same force across the wide ocean. By late 1943 and into 1944, the machine of American aviation has matured. Training pipelines multiply, and the industrial base delivers aircraft that begin to neutralize the Zero's earlier advantages. The F-6F Hellcat in particular embodies an engineering answer to a tactical problem. Heavier, better protected, and designed to sustain combat damage, it was a product of lessons learned and of manufacturing scale. When Hellcats and Corsairs appear in numbers, the tactical field is reconfigured. Japanese pilots continue to fight with skill and tenacity, but they now confront improved enemy hardware, a swelling pool of trained replacements, and the logistical capacity to maintain long campaigns. Marianas and the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 1944 revealed the compounded consequences of those changes. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft were overwhelmed in engagements where radar control, fighter direction, and sheer numerical advantage produced lopsided losses.
For Japanese flyers and their commanders, the defeats of 1944 were not simply about bravery or lack thereof. They were about material asymmetry and the cumulative cost of attrition. Personnel records from Japanese carrier air groups become thinner and more fragmented as the war's pressure mounts. Replacement pilots are younger and less seasoned. Here again, the archive speaks most clearly about men counted, planes lost, and the grinding arithmetic of replacement, not about the private nuances of gender identity. Those archival patterns suggest why certain questions are easier to ask than others. Records concern themselves with what is necessary to wage war: mission reports, ordnance loads, sortie counts, casualty lists, medical boards, and disciplinary records. For historians seeking to recover any evidence of gender variance among American pilots, the hunt runs against the grain of those record-keeping priorities. If an individual's gender expression deviated from the norms of the day, it would only enter the permanent file if it intersected with official concerns, a psychiatric evaluation, a court-martial, an administrative discharge. Even then, the language of the files, shaped by period medical theory and cultural stigma, often obscures more than it clarifies. This is where methodological exactitude becomes essential. Military personnel files, muster rolls, promotion logs, and combat reports are centrally relevant to reconstructing service history, but they are poor repositories for the subtleties of private gender identity. Medical and psychiatric records, by contrast, sometimes contain notes about behavior or presentations deemed anomalous. Yet these records were created within a diagnostic framework that pathologized difference. Terms like sexual deviance or psychopathic personality in 1940s files are not neutral descriptors. They are loaded clinical judgments shaped by the psychiatry of the era. When seeking to understand whether a pilot might have been transgender in a modern sense, historians must treat such records as symptomatic rather than explanatory. A 1944 notation of cross-dressing in a naval police bladder does not translate straightforwardly into a 21st century self-identification. Moreover, the U.S. Armed Services of World War II did not have explicit, standardized mechanisms for identifying or recording transgender identity because the conceptual categories were not generally available in the institutional lexicon. Selective service registration, enlistment physicals, and induction screening function to assign bodies to roles, often with the crude binary of male-female and fitness-unfitness. Cases of gender nonconformity were managed irregularly, sometimes ignored, sometimes subject to discharge, sometimes referred for psychiatric evaluation. Court-martials that touched on matters of sexual behavior tended to criminalize or punish actions labeled as indecent, rather than to probe internal identity.
If the historian's forensic patchwork turns to the Japanese side, yet different obstacles appear. Japanese military archives were damaged in the late stages of the conflict. Many operational files were destroyed intentionally to prevent capture or lost in the fires that accompanied defeat. What remains, unit diaries, pilots' letters, official communiques, and some veteran memoirs, gives a view into doctrinal thinking and morale, but tends to record what mattered to command and control. Japanese wartime propaganda and intelligence assessments emphasize national stereotypes and cultural criticism of the American enemy. They rarely demonstrate ethnographic nuance about individuals' private selves. To move beyond this methodological outline toward the question implicit in the title, what Japanese pilots really thought about transgender American pilots, requires putting these archival limits in conversation with cultural analysis. If we ask not whether Japanese records name transgender aviators, they do not, but rather whether Japanese discourse would have had the conceptual tools to notice and classify gender nonconformity in enemy pilots, the answer is complex. Japanese wartime propaganda frequently gendered the enemy for rhetorical effect. The notion of American decadence or softness was often deployed through imagery that feminized or infantilized an opponent. Such representations were cultural shorthand, aimed at rallying domestic populations and denigrating the enemy's civic virtue. They are not evidence that Japanese combatants were cataloging personal identities of individual American pilots. A flyer might internalize this rhetoric and imagine his adversary as effeminate in a cultural sense. He might then write that impression down in a letter as a way to reinforce the righteousness of his own cause. But those impressions are not the same as an observation that an enemy pilot lived or identified as a member of a gender minority. There is another layer to this interpretive work: battlefield identification. Under the stress of aerial engagement, recognition moves fast and practically. A pilot identifies friend or foe by silhouette, paint schemes, engine sound, and flight behavior. If a plane is shot down and the pilot captured, the interrogational record might reveal more about the individual's background. Prisoner of war interrogations can contain personal details: name, age, rank, hometown, and sometimes family history that could, in rare cases, disclose unusual biographical facts. But interrogations were designed to extract tactical and technical intelligence. The POW record is a potential but unlikely repository for disclosures about private gender identity, unless such facts were salient to the individual's capture or performance. Even when oddities appear in personnel or police records, historians must exercise caution.
A wartime police report noting that a serviceman was arrested for disorderly conduct while wearing female attire is a datum, not a conclusion. The historian must triangulate. Does the individual's personnel file corroborate disciplinary action? Is there a medical or psychiatric notation? Are there witness statements? Absent multiple independent sources, personnel file, medical/disciplinary documentation, and personal testimony, the case remains inconclusive and must be labeled as such. The files that survive are sometimes reticent for other reasons. American veteran oral histories, collected decades later, are shaped by memory, shame, pride, and the politics of recollection. In interviews, former pilots rarely dwell on the private gender behaviors of their comrades unless the subject was dramatic enough to have produced formal consequences. Veteran memoirs that discuss daily life in squadrons, mess hall routines, pranks, the rough intimacy of life aboard carrier decks do occasionally hint at gender play or costume pranks performed for humor or camaraderie. Those moments are not straightforward evidence of transgender identity. They are better read as indicators of the fluidity of gender performance in certain contexts, of the solidarities that allowed boundary testing within a male-dominated environment. Distinguishing between ritualized cross-dressing as a unit prank and an individual's persistent gender identity requires the kind of multi-source corroboration the DNA insists upon. Given these constraints, what can responsibly be said? Empirically, with respect to the primary wartime materials that historians commonly consult, unit diaries, personnel rosters, combat reports, POW interrogation logs, and extant medical files, there is no robust evidence that Japanese pilots, in their official or commonly available informal writings, made note of transgender American pilots as a recognized category. Label that conclusion indefinito. The sources do not support a claim that Japanese aviators observed, cataloged, and discussed transgender identities among their American adversaries in a manner that maps on contemporary understandings. This silence does not prove absence in reality. It may reflect institutional non-recognition, deliberate erasure, or the narrow focus of wartime record-keeping. Historians of sexuality and gender have long warned that silence in archives often indexes power, the power to name, to classify, and to deem certain facts worthy of recording. The absence of documentation about gender variance among aviators may be less an indicator of absolute non-existence than of the priorities of military bureaucracy and of the social stigmas that encourage discretion. Still, the larger historical pattern is illuminating in its own right. Japanese perceptions of American pilots shifted decisively over the course of the war, and the drivers of that shift are material and doctrinal.
Early rhetorical denigration of the enemy was replaced through repeated combat, through encounters with tactics like the thatch weave, through the attritional logic of Guadalcanal and the carrier losses at Midway.
by an appreciation of American endurance, industrial depth, and tactical adaptability. That evolution matters because it shows how cultural narratives, Yamato Damashi, notions of honor and martial purity, are bent, not broken, by operational realities. To make that point more concrete, consider the contrast between two images of combat: the romanticized dogfight, in which a pilot's skill and personal courage are decisive, and the radar-guided, vector-controlled mass engagement, where ground controllers, radar operators, and squadron coordination determine outcomes. The former aligns easily with a culture that prizes individual heroism. The latter favors systems. The Thatch Weave and its cousins altered the geometry of air combat in the Pacific. In doing so, they exhausted a cultural preference for solitary prowess and elevated a different set of values: communication, timing, and mutual trust. Japanese observers registered those changes as a shift in behavior and outcome, not as commentary on the private gender identity of individual adversaries. Now, to return explicitly to the question the title poses, what did the Japanese really think of transgender American pilots in World War II? The careful, evidence-driven response is a composite. First, as a factual matter based on the sources most historians consult, there is no documented discourse among Japanese aviators identifying or analyzing transgender American pilots as a category. That conclusion must be stated plainly, in definitive. Second, Japanese wartime rhetoric did sometimes feminize or denigrate the American opponent as a rhetorical device, but that rhetorical feminization is not equivalent to an ethnographic observation of gender identity. Third, the sparsity of archival documentation on private gender identity reflects both the priorities of wartime record-keeping and the stigmatizing medical and legal frameworks of the period. Those structures often rendered gender variance administratively visible only when it disrupted service or prompted formal sanction. What then are the promising avenues for further archival work if a researcher wanted to investigate this question more fully? The list is practicable and guided by the evidentiary protocol that historians use in other domains of social history. It begins with personnel files housed at the National Archives, muster rules, enlistment forms, and service records, looking for administrative anomalies, sudden discharges, medical referrals, psychiatric consultations, and court-martial transcripts. It continues with naval intelligence summaries and debriefs, which sometimes contain personal details of captured pilots. Medical records at military hospitals, if they survive, may include psychiatric evaluations or notes about unusual behavior. On the Japanese side, war diaries, pilot letters, and intelligence summaries in the defense archives could contain language of cultural critique, if not personal identification. Oral histories deserve careful re-examination, not as neutral repositories of fact, but as living memories shaped by decades of afterlife. Finally, period newspapers, military police logs, and local civil records around embarkation ports or rear areas could bear traces of incidents that, when triangulated, become historically meaningful. Methodologically, any such project must be structured by rigorous standards of corroboration. Single-source assertions are insufficient. A single mention of cross-dressing or non-conforming behavior should trigger a search for corroboration in at least two independent archival families: personnel/muster records, medical/psychiatric documentation, and contemporaneous witness testimony. Without that triangulation, a claim about historical transgender identity remains speculative. Where triple corroboration exists, a personnel file noting discharge for psychosexual disorder, a contemporaneous medical board report with diagnostic language, and a witness statement from a crewmate, then the historian can move beyond speculation to a more secure assertion, albeit with careful attention to period language and context. There are also ethical considerations that shape how historians should present such findings. Retroactive diagnosis is a perilous practice. Imposing contemporary categories on historical actors risks erasing the complexity and contingency of past self-understandings. If a pilot in 1943 was recorded as wearing female clothes in a portside incident, it would be irresponsible to translate that incident automatically into the modern category transgender. A better approach is to acknowledge ambiguity, to describe the behaviors and institutional responses precisely, and to contextualize them within the medical, legal, and social frameworks of the period. Consent and privacy concerns are also relevant when dealing with personal files. Researchers should weigh the public interest of scholarly knowledge against the potential harm to descendants or communities when publishing sensitive personal data. The post-war arc of reconciliation and memory offers a different but complementary set of sources for understanding perception.
After the conflict, veterans like Saburo Sakai participated in dialogues, interviews, and exchanges that reconfigured enemy images into narratives of shared sacrifice. Sakai's memoirs, interviews conducted by naval history projects, and meetings between former adversaries highlight a humanizing tendency. As geopolitical animosities cooled, personal recognition and appreciation of enemy skill became possible.
These post-war reflections cannot be used to reconstruct wartime perceptions without caution. They are mediated by hindsight, constrained memory, and the political imperatives of reconciliation, but they reveal how narratives can shift with time and how veterans make sense of their past actions. To synthesize, the most defensible historical answer to the title question is layered. Empirically, archives consulted so far do not provide direct evidence that Japanese pilots observed or labeled American aviators as transgender in any systematic way. Therefore, the presence of such a category in Japanese wartime thinking is indefinito. Interpreting what Japanese pilots thought about American masculinity more broadly is possible. Cultural rhetoric painted the American enemy in terms that often feminized or denigrated, but these were political tools rather than literal anthropological observations. The tactical and material realities of the Pacific War, the attrition of experienced pilots, the arrival of new American aircraft, tactical innovations like the thatch weave, explain how perceptions shifted from contempt to respect. Finally, the archival silence on gender variance is meaningful. It reflects both institutional priorities and the stigmatizing frameworks of the era, rather than a definitive statement about lived realities. There is a humane corollary to this scholarly exercise. Questions about past identities are not only academic curiosities, they have present-day resonance because debates about who can serve in uniform tap into long histories of inclusion and exclusion. Understanding how militaries recorded or refused to record deviance is part of understanding how institutions produce legible and illegible bodies. When records erase or obscure, they shape the public memory of who fought and who was deemed fit to fight. Recovering the silences, therefore, is an ethical project as much as an intellectual one. Before closing, it is worth pausing on a concrete example of the kind of cautious historiography required here. Suppose a researcher discovers a World War II naval police blotter that records an incident in which a sailor was arrested for wearing female attire while ashore. Suppose further that the personnel file confirms service aboard a carrier, and that a medical board note exists indicating a psychiatric evaluation. Alone, these records would be suggestive but not definitive. A responsible treatment would present the facts, describe the contemporary diagnostic language, and frame interpretations tentatively. It would explore alternative explanations, ritualized cross-dressing as prank, temporary behavior induced by alcohol, clandestine private identity, and the researcher would seek corroboration in personal letters, court records, or testimony from shipmates. Only after careful triangulation could a scholar make a claim about enduring gender identity.
Even then, that claim should be presented with the ambiguity and humility that the evidence permits. This restraint is not an evasion. It is fidelity to historical method. It honors the archival logic that privileges corroboration and recognizes the ethical stakes in labeling historical persons with identities that they themselves may never have voiced in public. When the archive speaks clearly on tactics, on sortie counts, on how a maneuver like the thatch weave erupted from necessity, it allows the historian to reconstruct with confidence. When the archive is silent or ambiguous about the intimate aspects of identity, that silence becomes part of the story. And so the final portrait is a composite of clarity and indeterminacy. On the level of combat and doctrine, Japanese pilots learned to reassess an adversary they had once caricatured. The evidence for that reassessment is abundant and well documented. On the level of private identity, the evidence is sparse, filtered through diagnostic language and institutional priorities that rarely recorded what did not impinge on combat fitness or discipline. Any categorical claim that Japanese pilots recognized or discussed transgender American pilots as such is unsupported by the core wartime sources. That categorical absence is what scholars must own up to when answering the title question. If this investigation leaves the viewer with two impressions, let them be these. First, that the history of air combat in the Pacific is a technical and human story in which doctrine, machine design, training, and attrition all shaped what pilots came to think of their enemies. And second, that certain kinds of human difference,
particularly those that institutions stigmatize, are frequently rendered invisible in the surviving records. It is the historian's job to read both what is present and what is absent with equal attention. For those who want to dig deeper, recommended next steps include a close examination of the repositories mentioned earlier, the National Archives personnel folders and unit war diaries, the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command squadron reports, Japanese Defense Archives for surviving IJN Air Group logs and pilot letters, oral history collections at the Library of Congress and the U.S. Naval Institute, and the archives of specialized research centers on gender and military service. Peer-reviewed work by aviation historians, John Lundstrom's Carrier Air Group Studies, Partial and Tully's analyses of IJN operations, and scholarship on sexuality and the military provide essential context for any sustained inquiry. Anyone pursuing this topic should approach medical and disciplinary records with a clear methodological plan and ethical caution, and should be prepared to label ambiguity where evidence remains incomplete. History in this register rewards patience and restraint over sensationalism.
The skies of 1942 through 44, with their braided tracery of contrails and the intermittent flare of exploding engines, remain a place where stories of courage, error, invention, and suffering coexist. The question of whether Japanese pilots saw American aviators as transgender is provocative. It prompts us to think about the limits of documentation and the politics of recognition. The honest answer, grounded in the sources we have and in the interpretive rules historians must observe, is that the archives do not support a definitive claim. The category remains, for now, indefinito. If this examination has sparked your curiosity and you want the detailed archival roadmap and further reading list that informed this investigation, check the description for sources and recommended archives. There are primary documents and scholarship that can take you deeper into the technical, cultural, and methodological issues explored here. Thank you for staying with this complex, sometimes melancholic, but necessary inquiry into how wartime perception is shaped by machines, doctrine, and the limits of record-keeping.